my really warm welcome to you, and it's really good to have the chance in this first of our monthly webinar series to introduce part of the framework to you. I'll just put up my presentation, which will help with that. Paul's mentioned the framework which is available to you, and what we want to do in this first of the webinars is focus on the first part of the framework. So within the framework, we were wanting not to assume that it's obvious to people that farmed animal welfare it has a particular connection to understandings of Christianity. And so the first part of the framework does some work to discuss why we consider Christians should be concerned about farmed animal welfare. So what the connections are between Christian belief and practice and the welfare of farmed animals. And so in the first sort of 10-minute section, I just want to give you a quick overview of that first section. And I'll do that by giving a series of answers to why farmed animal welfare should matter to Christians. And the first answer I want to give is that farmed animal welfare should matter to Christians because Christians eat. So Christians eat, and in particular, most Christians eat animal products. So that means the eating of animals is part of a sort of everyday, ordinary practice for Christians. And it's also part of religious practice. Shared meals are an important part of Christian practice. In non-lockdown times, Christians might well share food in sort of before or after services, as well as think about the Eucharist as a sort of ritual shared meal. So food matters to Christians, and because and that means we're connected to farmed animals in a particular way through the practice of consumption. So I think Christians have got good reasons for being concerned about the welfare of all kinds of animals, but it seems to me that we're responsible for farmed animals in a different way than we are, say, to the welfare of African lions, because although we might want to do things that impact on the welfare of African lions, we're particularly bound up with the well-being of farmed animals, the ones we're involved in consumption. And often, obviously, many Christians are also involved in the production and the retail of animal products as well. So we're kind of implicated with the lives of farmed animals, and that's a particular reason for being concerned about the welfare of farmed animals. As we'll be talking about in the next webinar, when we're talking in more detail about what animals need to flourish, some animals are faring particularly badly in modern agricultural production systems. Chickens, fish, intensively farmed pigs, intensively farmed dairy cows, we pick out in part 3 of the report as animals who often are raised in situations that give them poor opportunities for flourishing. And so if we're implicated with animals who are not having good opportunities for flourishing, that gives us reason for ethical concern. So first reason why Christians should be concerned about farmed animal welfare is that Christians eat animal products that derive from farming systems. The second reason I want to give for why farmed animal welfare should be an issue for Christians is that creaturely flourishing matters in a Christian faith context. For me, the most basic way of talking about this is to start from the position that Christians are monotheists. Christians believe that there is one God. Christians believe in a God who is the creator and sustainer of all creatures, not just human ones. And so that leads us to say in the framework that Christians believe that all creatures share the creaturely purpose of glorifying God in their flourishing. Christians worship a God who is the God of all creatures, and one way of understanding and construing the creaturely purpose, the purpose of being a creature, if you've ever wondered what's life for, one Christian answer of that is that the purpose of creatures is to glorify God in their flourishing. And we say in the framework, the ultimate purpose of all creation is to express the goodness and love of God in ceaseless praise and in the presence of God. And we find that in different parts of the Bible, but pick out the Psalms of Creation 145, 148, 150, and this vision of creaturely praise in the book of Revelation. You might say, well, where do you find that understanding of the purpose of creatures? And we find that throughout the Bible, and we review this in part 1 of the framework. So Genesis 1, the very opening chapter of the Bible, affirms that all creatures are created by God and declared good by God. In the Old Testament law, there is provision for compassionate treatment of farmed and wild animals. So it seems that being a holy people of God includes concern for the well-being of farmed and wild animals. The Psalms envision the whole creation praising God in response to God's grace in creation and providence, each in their own way, each given their own sort of creaturely space to glorify God in their particular way. The prophets look forward to a time when every creature will live peaceably with one another. During Advent, if you went to church services, you may have heard Isaiah 11 read, which is a time when the Messiah, prophecy of when the Messiah comes, animals will live peaceably with one another, the wolf lying down with the lamb. Fast forwarding to the New Testament, Jesus teaches that birds and lilies should be models for discipleship in terms of recipients of God's care without thinking about what follows, and also takes it for granted in his teaching that his audience recognizes with him that not a single sparrow falls apart from God. So not a single sparrow is forgotten by God. And so a sort of strong affirmation of a Jewish recognition that God has dealings with the lives of all kinds of creatures. And then in the New Testament, we also find visions of reconciliation and redemption that are inclusive of all kinds of creatures. Paul's teaching in Romans 8 that the whole creation is groaning with labor pains for its liberation as the children of God. And opening of the letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians, where the work of Christ is envisaged as reconciling all things in heaven and earth to God. So we've got really strong biblical reasons for thinking that Christian faith requires us to recognize that God is concerned with more than just the human. So reason 1, Christians eat. Reason 2, Christians believe in a God who wills the flourishing of all kinds of creatures. Reason 3, farmed animals are creatures of God too. I don't know how many of you have been watching David Attenborough's new series, The Perfect Planet, but last night I was sitting down watching that with my family and watching these wonderful images of Arctic wolves and huge numbers of Canadian garter snakes and Chinese monkeys, beautiful photography, beautiful creatures. But I think sometimes we think of the sort of wonderful creatures of God in that kind of wildlife documentary mode, rather than in relation to the kinds of animals we use for food. But it seems to me really obvious and important to affirm that farmed animals are creatures of God too. And not only that, but we need to recognize that we've so far expanded animal agriculture that the combined biomass of farmed animals is now 24 times greater than that of all wild land mammals. 24 times greater, the mass of all farmed animals. So if we're concerned about animal welfare, we should be 24 times more concerned about farmed animal welfare, it seems to me, than wild animal welfare, in the sense of these are the animals with whom we have that we share the planet with, given our current systems. And so farmed animals are creatures of God too, and that's clear to us. Part of the project included making farm visits in pre-COVID times. And one of the happiest times I had on farm visit is pictured here, where we were visiting an organic pig farm and seeing pigs really obviously flourishing, wallowing in water, running around as piglets, suckling from their mothers, rooting in the earth as pigs like to do. And so farmed animal flourishing matters in a Christian context, because farmed animals are creatures of God. There's an awful lot of them now, and so that's a big problem. And we recognise in the project that engaging with farmed animal welfare is complicated. It has links to the well-being of humans who rely on animals for food. It has implications for the well-being of humans who make their living through animal agriculture in different ways. It has important implications that we're finding out much more about in terms of climate and other environmental issues as well. And later we'll be discussing some of these complexities, and in future webinars we'll be addressing them still more. But it seems to me to be really important to start with this fundamental and simple recognition that Christians have strong faith-based reasons for caring about farmed animal welfare. So we say in the framework, Christians have strong faith-based reasons to be concerned about the ability of fellow animal creatures to reveal God's goodness in their flourishing lives. So why should Christians care about farmed animal welfare? First of all, they eat. Second, they believe in a God who is the creator and sustainer of all kinds of creatures, including, and thirdly, farmed animals are among those creatures, and so should be some of the creatures we're concerned about. So that's my sort of initial pitch, and we're now going to move to a conversation where Margaret is going to put some questions picking up on some of these issues.
Hello, thank you, David. You can hear and see me. I want to put to you, David, some of the kinds of questions that we often receive from other people. So, isn't Christianity about what I believe? What does, can't I choose the things I do? So what does faith have to do with what I feel like eating or what my family has always eaten?
Thanks, Margaret. Yes, so here's a really fundamental question, which is about what it means to be a Christian and what it might mean to think about Christian ethics before we get on to farmed animal welfare as such. And it seems to us really important to recognize that what Christians believe has important implications for how they live. And that's true in all kinds of ways. Jesus taught, for example, about neighbor love and not walking past on the other side of the road when someone is in need. That's been powerfully operative in the way Christians understand their ethical responsibilities. But it's true in all kinds of other ways too. And we think that Christian beliefs about creation, as I've been explaining, have really important implications for how Christians choose to live. So so believing the kinds of things Christians believe, doing the kinds of things Christians do when they practice their faith, we think has important implications for how you live as a Christian. And farmed animal welfare is one issue that Christians perhaps haven't been very attentive to in the modern period, although it's been interesting in the project research to realize that Christians in the 19th century were quite exercised about farmed animal welfare and saw an important connection with their faith.
All right, that's helpful. But people are important. Shouldn't people be most important when we have people who are starving, who are dying? How could animals be more important than people?
Yeah, and that's a really important question. And there are some takes on animal ethics that seem to suggest we're in a sort of zero-sum game, and we need to So Peter Singer, for example, the atheistic utilitarian philosopher, has this slogan, all animals are equal, and that provokes all kinds of concerns that how are we going to care adequately for humans if Singer is telling us that we ought to be caring equally about different kinds of animals. That's not what we're saying in this project. We don't think there's a zero-sum game between the interests of animal creatures and the interests of human creatures. We see them together as fellow creatures of God, recipients of God's grace, and called to flourish together. And so it's absolutely appropriate in many, many contexts to prioritize human flourishing, and that's what we do. And there's nothing in this framework that suggests that it isn't a proper thing to do to prioritize human flourishing. But because God and therefore Christians are properly concerned about human flourishing is not a reason to be unconcerned about the flourishing of all the other creatures of God. And in particular, the kinds of ways we are raising farmed animals at the moment are often problematic, not only for farmed animals, but for wild animals and for humans and for the wider environment. And so we are interested in looking for paths to make progress in relation to farmed animal welfare that are attentive to that wider context of ensuring that it doesn't mean that humans are going to go hungry, for example, or it's not going to be catastrophic for our environment if we take particular actions in relation to farmed animal welfare. So we need to have a priority concerned about human welfare, but that doesn't mean we can't afford to be concerned about farmed animals too.
Okay, but let's go back to the Bible. Aren't animals created for people to eat? And doesn't God give people animals to eat?
Thanks. So that's almost the question that got me started in relation to all of this. So I had conversations, sitting next to people in church pews, and they'd say, "Well, so what are you working on?" And I say, "Well, I'm interested in Christian attitudes to animals," and that question is often the first thing that people would say to me. Well, didn't God make the animals for us to eat? And if I'm given the time with someone, what I'd like to do is to sort of sit down and open the Bible with them and have a look. And as I'd already referenced, you don't need to read beyond the first page of Genesis to get an answer to that question, which is God. So in Genesis 1, the account goes that God creates all kinds of creatures, declares them good in their own right without reference to their utility to any other kinds of creatures. And here's the kicker, at the end of Genesis 1, gives a plant-based diet for all kinds of creatures to eat. And so it's really clear in that initial sort of originating vision of Genesis that as kind of when Earth was kind of sort of properly ordered by God, there's a vision of sort of peaceable relations between creatures, and it's certainly not no animals are eating other animals in that Genesis vision, just as they're not in the Isaiah 11 vision I referenced before. And so we do get a sort of later twist in the tale when we get to Genesis 9. After the flood, God gives permission for meat eating explicitly for the first time. And some people talk about that as a kind of sort of creation Mark II on God's part, a sort of second go, because it went so badly wrong the first time around. But it's certainly the case that animals have an existence from God in their own right and are called to flourish by God apart from their utility to human beings, and there is this permission to consume animals under certain conditions in the biblical text, but it's certainly not the case that the Bible says that God created animals for humans.
Okay, but Jesus wasn't a vegetarian, and in fact, the whole scriptural life and ongoing life of the chosen people of God, of Judaism, gives instructions for in what ways to eat animals, not don't eat them. Mm-hmm. What do we do about that?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to note that both in the context of Judaism and Christianity, the eating of animals has been a sort of topic of interest and lively concern. You know, the New Testament church is disagreeing about consuming animals. Paul has to write letters addressing this issue directly. And so both Jews and Christians have been concerned about how this eating animal stuff fits with their faith commitments for a long time. And one representation of a sort of mainstream position in Christianity from kind of medieval times up until the sort of 19th century is that it was thought it was appropriate to be using animals for food where that was necessary and for other purposes. But you should never use animals in a way that was subjecting them to suffering or cruelty that was unnecessary. So that I think is, you know, an important characterization of a sort of mainstream position that it was okay, you know, it was okay to use them where you had to, but you should do that in a way that respected them as fellow creatures, and you shouldn't subject them to any suffering that was unnecessary. And so I think that's where our policy framework fits very well within that kind of moderate position. Some Christians have always thought that it had to do with faith to give up animals entirely. You know, elements of a monastic diet very early on in the Christian tradition, you know, tried to have very little to do with consuming animals at all. But the mainstream position has been it's been okay, but we need to make sure the animals are well treated and not subjected to unnecessary cruelty. And that's quite close to a lot of the things that we're saying. And what's changed as far as what we're saying in the framework is that, you know, in recent decades, we've radically transformed the ways we're farming animals. And so that's a big shift from both Jesus's practice and the practice of Christians in earlier centuries and earlier generations. We're not eating animals in the same way that our grandparents and great-grandparents were, for example. We need to pay attention to that. And part 3 of the framework tries to kind of set out quite carefully the kinds of animals we're farming, the kinds of things that they need, and the way that those needs are or aren't met within modern farming systems.
Thank you. Now you're talking about modern farming, but when you talk about animals and consumption in general, is it more okay to eat some animals than others? Does sentience matter? I mean, is there a line between animals that we should care more about and animals we shouldn't care as much about?
I think we ought to be concerned about animals in sort of multiple ways and for multiple reasons. So animals that seem particularly vulnerable to being sort of impacted by, you know, treating them in particular ways, we ought to be attentive to that. So, you know, ants and chimpanzees need different things in their flourishing, and that means the ethics of how you treat ants and chimpanzees is very importantly different. And we shouldn't think that just one sort of animal ethical approach is likely to be useful in assessing our responsibilities towards ants and chimpanzees. And so I think our ability to empathize with other creatures like fellow mammals, for example, and our understanding of commonalities with them, both cognitively and in terms of maternal care, gives us particular reasons to be concerned about that. So one of the practices we pick up in the report is that in modern dairying, calves are taken away from cows very soon after birth, sometimes even before the cows meet them. And I think that our common sense of what it means to be a mammal gives us some basic sense of there's something that doesn't seem quite right about that. And there's a reason why some farmers are experimenting with systems in which calves get to spend longer with their mothers. And so that sense of commonality gives us an important reason to sort of empathetically engage with the ethics of, you know, the circumstances under which that is appropriate. But I wouldn't want to put everything down to how far animals are similar to us either. I think we ought to be able to empathise with animals that are quite other than us. And so in our work, in what we say about fish, for example, it's really interesting because I think the kind of environment that the kind of environments we ought to be attentive in relation to what fish need to flourish could be very, very different, obviously, from the kinds of ways in which mammals do. And so we need to be prepared to engage with the sort of otherness of creatures as well as their similarity with us in order to think well about what it's appropriate to do in relation to other creatures, including eating them.
So are you really saying that in order to be good Christians, we have to be vegans?
No, I'm really not saying that. Because, I mean, in other contexts, I have talked about reasons Christians might consider veganism as an option. And I think there are reasons to take that seriously. But I'm not by no means convinced that that's going to be something that the mainstream church receives or recognizes as a Christian responsibility anytime soon. The thing that I really think the whole church ought to be open to understanding right now on the basis of the kinds of arguments we're setting out is that farmed animal welfare is a concern for Christians. And so I don't want people to rush to the question of is it vegan or nothing? I want people to think about, wait a minute, we're farming all of these animals. We're implicated with consuming them and selling them and producing them. What does that look like? And are there ways we could shift that and make that better? And I think the whole church ought to be receiving the idea that farmed animal welfare is a concern for Christians, and then we can have a discussion about what follows when we realise that not everything is okay in relation to how animals are being farmed at the moment.
That's great. Thank you. I could bring up more questions, but I think this would be a good time to hear from some other people who've been listening and muted who might actually want to contribute to the conversation. So let's open it up. You can raise your hand to speak, or you can, or Paul who's monitoring, will look and can speak questions out loud that have been written. So I'll pass it over to Paul.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret and David. That was really great conversation. We've had some nice questions in the chat. I think some more have just come in. As you say, please raise your hand if anyone has any more. The first was about the prioritization of alleviating the suffering of different animals, which I think you addressed nicely. And Christina made a good point there about dispensation of kind of original choice, which is a kind of choice rather than a command. There was another question from Caleb about which I think is a sort of suggested resource, or do you have any tips about common arguments for eating animals to talk to with other Christians about, if I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we're doing in the project we're working on at the moment is a frequently asked questions document that will address some of these questions that we bump into most frequently. If people are interested in other publications that are sort of addressing some sort of common questions about Christianity and animals, there's a really good book called A Faith Embracing All Creatures, which has lots of fairly short, popular level sort of contributions from different authors addressing different aspects of that question. So our frequently asked questions will be a document that we hope will answer some of the questions that we bump into most frequently. So Caleb, we may get to some of the ones that you're interested in that document, but I do recommend that Faith Embracing All Creatures book as a wider resource.
And there's an additional question to that, which may have been answered, but about responses or kind of objections to CEFAW's mission. How might we respond to some of those? Because there have been some regarding farmers' welfare, other elements as well. Do either of you have any responses to that?
So there are a number of concerns people might raise, and they range from, our family has traditional meals that are part of our heritage, part of who we are, that involve meat. And this has never been bad in the past. What makes it problematic now when it wasn't 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or at least no one was talking about that? And one of the things we talk about is that a number of things have changed. We know a lot more about the lives of the animals that we traditionally farm and eat, including what their experiences are like. But also the means of farming, the methods of farming have changed such that a much higher percentage of farming happens in industrialized context of intensified concentrated animals for higher mass production, for a more effective way of producing a lot more animal products. And these animals can't experience the ways they would have lived otherwise. So they don't get out of doors, or they can't graze or forage, or they can't have family relationships like David was talking about. Cows and calves, same with sows and piglets. They're often there, or chickens never see their chicks. So there are ways in which the life of farmed animals more recently, these lives have fewer chances of flourishing. So that would be one direction.
Mm-hmm.
You want to try another, David?
Yeah, I mean, a second really important one that we've kind of been engaging with throughout the project is that, how can we sort of write and be concerned about these particular sort of details in the lives of farmed animals without realizing the position of farmers trying to make a living from this practice at this particular moment. And another of the things that was really helpful about the farm site visits is we got out talking to people who were making a living from animal agriculture. We had, one really useful lunchtime meeting after having looked around an intensive dairy farm. We had a chance to talk to NFU dairy representatives who were talking about what it was like to try and run a dairy farm just at the moment. This was about a year before Brexit, and they were facing sort of astonishing range of uncertainties, including what sort of trade deals might look like, whether they'd be able to get migrant workers in to do the labour that they needed for their farms, how they could possibly make farm investments on the basis of a 5-year or a 10-year or a 15-year plan, on the basis of radical uncertainties about what was going to happen in relation to climate change and carbon budgets and so on. And so we became really attentive, and some of the church representatives were national rural officers on the project, and so it was really helpful right from the beginning to be plugged into, this is what it feels like to be a farmer trying to make a living. This is what it feels like to be a member of a rural community very threatened by sort of prospect of vegan activism taking away livelihoods. And we wanted to write our policy framework in a way that demonstrated we were attentive to the position of people in this industry, but that hasn't weakened our sense, which I think is now part of a really wide and growing consensus, that a big change is going to be necessary in the way we do food, for animal welfare reasons, but also for environmental reasons, and also in relation to different sort of global challenges. So more of the same is not going to be sustainable in any respect. And so then the question for churches and Christians as they engage this issue is, how could they be attentive to animal welfare and the environment and the well-being of rural communities, and seek to support changes that are going to be positive and productive for all of those. And some of what we say in the framework is bad news for people currently making a living through farming practices which we say give farm animals poor opportunities for flourishing. So, for example, unenriched warehouses growing broiler chicken in to slaughter weight in 35 days. We say that gives chickens poor opportunities for flourishing, and people should stop buying chicken that comes from those places and support farmers that are giving raising chickens in ways that give them more opportunities for flourishing. So that's sort of bad. So less good news for farmers that are currently operating these other systems. But when I visited myself a broiler chicken facility, the manager of the facility said, I don't care how the chickens are raised. This is what people are buying, and so therefore this is what I'm producing. And by the way, I get a profit margin of 1 penny per bird, David, on for these chickens. So that really convinced me that engaging the church at large with this challenge, and not just suggesting farmers are the villains of the any kind of villains in the piece, is really crucial. And so we hope the framework will help expand the market for farmers who are giving farmed animals in their care good opportunities for flourishing, as we're describing them in the framework.
If I could add to that, one of the real challenges of trying to talk about a specific concern, so the welfare of farmed animals, is that it's also very easy then to look for a simple cause, right? It's a problem with farmed animals. So is it the fault of the farmers? Is it the fault of the consumers? Is it the fault of retailers? And everyone who works in between, and corporate heads, and all of the employees involved. And what we're trying to say is it's not the farmer's fault. It's not your fault for what you buy in the store. It's a system problem. It's a huge web of problems. The problem with recognizing that is that it often makes us feel like, well, how could I change a system? I'm just one person, and that can be just overwhelming. So I might as well just keep on doing what I've been doing. And this is one of the gifts I think that the church has, is that there's already a narrative for what it's like to be Christians with ideas about the best ways to live, the best ways to be disciples in a world that's not shaped that way. We know that we don't get things right, but it's also possible to talk about and take specific actions in relation to big problems. So we would encourage each other and everyone else to realize that farmers only do what they have the resources to do. And if they had more assistance in some areas, either by what consumers are looking for or contracts with retailers and so on, then they would be able to change things. Similar with everyone in the whole web.
Great. And we've got a couple more questions. One is a very short question, and the next is a more complex question. I think we've just had a very long question, which I've not read yet. The first is, David, what is your personal preferred diet? Perhaps both of you could answer that. And second is about, are there some forms of life that should not flourish, such as bacteria or diseases or virus? I'm sure we could all think of a particular virus that we might not like to be flourishing as much as it is. Plants, etc. Or do we have a duty to enable the flourishing of forms of life only with consciousness? So either of you of those.
Thanks. Yeah, so I turned vegetarian when I was 18. As a teenager, I got sort of increasingly concerned about what I was learning about sort of suffering of animals. And as soon as I had a sort of diet that was entirely under my control, I said I made the decision that if I can get by without causing suffering, death of animals, I'll do that. So I turned vegetarian then, and I've been vegan for sort of more than half of the time since, as I began to make connections with sort of eggs and dairy as well. As a research team, we're kind of more of a mixed bag. Some members of the research team, and we were all attentive to farmed animal welfare, as you can imagine, but some members of the research team would eat meat occasionally, but make sure that it comes from sources where animals have had flourishing lives. And as I said before, I think rather than a sort of vegan for and against argument, I'm much more interested in provoking a discussion in the churches about the kinds of quantities and kinds of animals that we're eating. And our framework recommends that people reduce their overall consumption of animals, because that's important for a variety of reasons, including animal welfare, and that they should switch, in terms of churches and organizational policy, towards away from sources that give animals poor opportunities for flourishing, and switch towards environments that give animals what we grade as better and then best opportunities for flourishing. And RSPCA Assured is a kind of good way of recognizing the sort of better category, and organic, pasture-fed livestock, and free-range dairy are good markers to look for in terms of that sort of best of what we label as best available.
And what about the forms of life we don't like or that are problematic? Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is a matter of particularity of who we are as people, right? We can appreciate and engage with some forms of life better than others. And the fact that we're concerned for animal welfare doesn't mean, again, that we're prioritizing all other forms of life over humans. I mean, one short answer would be, we need to be making discernments about this together all the time, right? These aren't individual decisions. So we should be meeting with the people with whom we share understanding of creation, understanding of God, and talking through what are the resources we have, what can we get through scripture, what can we get through various traditions about, and what's our situation now in relation to viruses and bacteria and so on. And how have those situations changed as our use of the world has changed in different ways too.
The other bit there that I think is distinctive about a Christian understanding of these issues is to recognize that a Christian sort of understanding of living within a fallen creation means that we can't get everything right. Not all creatures can flourish. Not all humans flourish. Not all of us flourish for all of our lives. And not all animals flourish, and not all plants flourish. We live in a fallen creation where creaturely relationships are broken. And Paul's, that vision of Paul in Romans 8 that I referred to, the whole of creation is sort of groaning under these current conditions and longing for this release when full flourishing will be possible, and that liberation will be achieved. But what that means, well, that frames helpfully, I think, is that we can't expect perfection in relation to any of our efforts in this area. We're not kind of thinking we can eat our way to salvation. All we're doing is trying to engage with these broken creaturely relationships and look for faithful ways to respond according to a sort of faith in God's ways with the world that we've received. And so that means, the COVID-19 virus and humans can't co-flourish without, very great difficulty. And so eradicating or controlling the virus as we've controlled other viruses is a really important and morally worthy act. But most of our dealings with other creatures are not zero-sum in that kind of way. And we can certainly flourish alongside other animal creatures in ways that are much more better, much preferable for both for us and for them than we're currently doing.
That sort of reminded me of something Margaret said earlier about, that we do get it wrong as well, and that it's not that there's a sort of clear-cut way that everything must be done. We're just talking about it and trying to kind of move towards what we think is a world in which kind of more beings can flourish. There was a question or a kind of suggestion about an ethical company called Gusto, and I guess to sort of, I think that's a sort of specific request, but also thinking of it as a kind of question, which we'll be talking about in a later webinar, I know, about how we can, as individuals or as kind of a church or a kind of through CEFAW, a kind of network of people perhaps who are interested in this subject of improving farmed animal welfare, how can we kind of have agency there, or where can we make change?
Yeah, this is the thing I find really exciting about engaging with the sort of ethics of food and consumption, because this is part of our everyday practice, both individually and as families and as institutions that we're part of. That means we've got opportunities for actions that help to effect really significant change. Reducing the demand for chicken coming out of those broiler facilities where chickens have a really big time will mean in time fewer chickens are being raised in those conditions. And so there's a really exciting opportunity, I think, for people to be engaged in this. And so that could start small scale in terms of what we decide to buy and eat ourselves. But I really hope that this report might encourage churches at a church level to say, okay, then whenever the next time is that we are going to get together for a meal, can we take some time to think about what we would want to put on the menu in the light of the CEFAW policy framework? But we also hope that this might be useful at different levels. So lots of churches at a sort of regional diocesan level might have environmental sustainability policies. We hope that people on those kinds of committees might pick up this report and say, okay, what might this mean for how we do catering at, in any of our diocesan events? Or we hope at a national level, this could be helpful too, in terms of churches saying, okay, we haven't got any policy about farmed animal welfare. Can we take this framework and reflect on what policy we could adopt on the basis of the work that's been done? But people are part of other kinds of organizations too. So Christians might be part of particular charities, charitable organizations, for example. They might think about how they do catering and how their work impacts on farmed animal welfare. And if people are sort of puzzled about where to start, I think my recommendation would be just trying to find one or two other people that you might begin a conversation with, either in your organization or your place of work or in your church community, and start to think about some of these ideas and think about, okay, well, what might be next steps? Who else might we talk to? What might we propose on the basis of what we find in the policy framework recommendations?
I wonder if I could pick up on an additional question about what about animals that we farm but not for food, for other purposes? And what about animals raised for consumers right of ways in other countries or in other parts of the world? And I think we found it makes most sense, or it's most possible to communicate and to focus when we're talking about something with some particularity. So this is a particular research grant from the UK, with UK funding, and we are trying to address churches, and we focused on animals farmed chiefly for food for the purposes of this conversation. You may know in David's second volume of On Animals, he discusses animals that humans engage with and use across the board, not just food, but for clothing, for entertainment, companionship. But I think a lot of the arguments that we are trying to make, or a lot of the conversations we're trying to encourage that have to do with our relationship to animals farmed for human consumption, food-wise, could be extended in a variety of ways to other ways that we raise and use animals for human consumption. And then the questions would be, at least in terms of our project, what resources do Christians have for considering the welfare of those animals and then making changes consistent with the faith claims that Christians make.
Super, thank you. A last question, perhaps, about the subject of souls. Obviously, many Christians believe that only humans have souls. Should Christians consider that animals too are creatures with souls rather than just commodities?
Yeah, I think souls is a really interesting question. It's something that sort of often comes up in these conversations. One of the things that I think is helpful to learn from the kind of history of Christian theological tradition and its engagement with other philosophical traditions like Greek and Roman philosophy is that the idea that animals have souls is until recently completely uncontroversial. So the Greeks had this idea that that soul was the sort of life force in anything living. And so anything living must have a soul, because otherwise it wouldn't be alive. And then they went one step further and said, well, plants must have one kind of soul, a vegetative soul that allows them to take in nutrition and grow. And animals must have another kind of soul because they're sensitive to their environments and they can move around. And human beings must have another kind of soul. Well, would have a vegetative and an animal and a rational soul, because they can think in ways that we don't see other animals thinking. Now, I think we need to revise our, and that was kind of largely uncontroversial until we get to sort of Descartes in the 16th century, where he was concerned if there are all these souls around, and he was at a time when people were staring down microscopes and noticing really, really tiny animals. Descartes said he was worried about that the Christian doctrine of heaven would become implausible if all of these creatures had souls. There wouldn't be room for them all. And so he proposed that other sort of non-human animals were all automatons, robots, mechanisms, and only human beings had souls. Now, I think there's really good reasons to discount that. We've discovered since Descartes all kinds of different continuities between us and other animals, including evolutionary heritage, to recognize that kind of absolute discontinuity is really implausible. And so I think Christians should be, the theological categories I find most helpful are to recognize that animals like us are creatures of God. Animals have flesh, which is basar in the Hebrew, or sarx in the Greek, that in common with other animals. Humans have the breath of God in common with other animal creatures. And then there are some distinctive things about being a human being in relationship to God, and we get to exercise our particular creatureliness in particular ways. But I don't think soul is a particularly useful way of demarcating distinctions between creatures in that kind of way, or understanding what our moral responsibilities might be towards them.
At the very least, we should pay attention to what we mean by soul and how soul has meant in so many different ways across languages, as well as across communities and centuries. Yeah. So one of the problems with saying, do animals have a soul, as if that would solve a problem, is it suggests there's one kind of soul. We know what it means, and it's human souls, and we're asking whether animals have human souls or not, or souls as valuable as humans, which I think really underestimates God's creating capacity, God's creation, and the particularity of all different animals. The most important thing about being an animal is not being like a human animal.
Fantastic. I think that's a lovely note to end on, as we're almost at 2 o'clock. So I'd just like to thank David and Margaret very much for their contributions, and thank everybody else for attending. Just a reminder that I'll pop it in the chat there. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Yeah,
I can put up a slide with the webinar program, Paul, if
you have that to hand, that would be great. Yeah, so the next webinars are they're all on the second Wednesday of the month. So the next one will be How to Farm Animals Flourish, and for that one we'll have Dr. Siobhan Mullen, who's a veterinary scientist, and Dr. David Grummet, who's a theologian, who both know a huge amount about animals. And
you're automatically registered if you registered for this one, so I will send you a reminder and a new link for each one.
Great, thank you, Margaret. And then the forthcoming ones in March and April as well should be really great. So do put those in your diary, and we look forward to seeing you then. And don't forget that the framework document, you can order a copy, download a copy. On that page as well, you can view the videos as well from the launch and the project video. Any last words, David, Margaret?
Thanks for being here.
Really grateful for people's attendance and participation, and look forward to continuing the conversation next month.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye. Thank you.